Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Ford. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to the prestigious Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture 2021. It's fantastic, isn't it, that we can all get together virtually for this really special event, and it's great to have so many people joining us. Although I've only been in post for just over 6 months now, this is actually my second Elizabeth Casson Lecture. Last year, I tried to sneak in virtually into the back row as my interview was just a couple of weeks later. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to check out what I might be letting myself in for. But I was really inspired by Jenny's presentation. And it was great to be able to build on some of the points and the stories that Jenny told in my interview. So for me, it was a really productive and engaging session. I know that today will be for everybody else as well. So although we can't see each other face to face, please do use the chat tab to connect to one another and the questions tab to submit questions to our Casson lecturer, as later we'll have time for a short Q&A session. So a little bit of history. The first Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture was held in 1973. I'd be really interested to know, has anybody attended every single one? Well, who wants to claim to have attended the most? So yeah, first held in 1973, the annual lecture is held in honor of Dr. Elizabeth Casson and her contribution to the occupational therapy profession. As the first woman awarded a medical degree from the University of Bristol in 1919, Dr. Casson introduced occupational therapy to England, and in 1929 established the first occupational therapy school, Dorset House in Bristol. And it's in recognition of Dr. Casson's commitment to further occupational therapy that the lectureship is an honour awarded to a Royal College of Occupational Therapists member who's considered by their peers to have made and to be making significant contribution to the profession's development. So in her personal and professional capacity, Musharat Ahmed Landayu, Senior Lecturer in Occupational Therapy and Student Success and Anti-Racist Education Practitioner at London South Bank University, nominated this year's lecturer. So I'd now like to invite Mish to introduce the 2021 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and hello, everyone. I'm going to start then. In 1996, Elizabeth Yates, a Black occupational therapist and educator, delivered the Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture on Equalising Opportunities. It is 2021, and we have the second person of Global South heritage delivering the Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture, Dr. Anita Atwal, whose heritage is Sikh Punjabi. She is currently Associate Professor of Interprofessional Education at London South Bank University, where I got to know the magnificence that is Anita. I'd just like to talk you through Dr. Atwal's journey from student to where she is now, because it sets the scene for the lecture you will hear from her today. She qualified from Derby University in 1989. Dr. Atwal says it was an interesting time to graduate, as this was a point in occupational therapy history and evolution. The profession was moving away from trying to fit in with established psychological and biomechanical sciences and finding its own identity in the emerging occupational science led by people such as Gary Kielhofner, Anne Wilcock, and Ruth Zemecker. Dr. Atwal left Derby and moved to London and was in a large mixed rotation post where she worked with Elizabeth McLennan and Stephanie Correa. It was not usual for organisations to offer mixed rotations, for example, across peds, older adults, and mental health. So you can see she, Anita, was already doing things differently. Her clinical career continued on in London, and in 1993, she was accepted to study for a master's by Dr. Tony Lieber. She was given an opportunity by him, even though her undergraduate was a diploma in occupational therapy. She completed her master's in interprofessional health and social welfare in 1995 at London South Bank University. Then, while she was working as a senior occupational therapist at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, she was encouraged to apply for a PhD. So she did, and she got a full-time scholarship to complete her PhD with Middlesex University, 1996 to 1999. The title of her PhD thesis is The Battlefield, Discharge Planning and Multidisciplinary Teamwork. She has published a considerable number of papers from her PhD, role modeling that you can publish more than one article from using your PhD. Dr. Atwal joined Brunel University as a senior lecturer in 1996, where she stayed for 19 years. She was the first lecturer in occupational therapy at Brunel with a PhD. So again, leading through role modeling. She remembers that Christine Craig said she noticed Dr. Atwal at her interview because of what she had said, that throughout her career, people opened up opportunities for her because they saw her talents, her potential, and because it was the right time and right place to open up the opportunity for her to progress in her career. In 2015, she joined London South Bank University as Associate Professor. There, she carried on with her interest in multidisciplinary working, how to progress it, how to capitalize from it for the benefit of all. This is where I got to meet Anita and have some of her passion for people, especially students, courage in her convictions and generosity in sharing her knowledge and experience rub off on me to fuel the fire in my belly about promoting equity and justice in occupational therapy education and the profession. Anita, on top of all this wonderfulness and busyness, is a force majeure when it comes to writing and publishing. She has nigh on 86 publications attached to her name. So people, here today, here is Dr. Anita Atwal, considerate, committed, and cultivating conversations of courage to encourage the next evolution of occupational therapy for the profession to catch up with, represent all its practitioners and the people they serve, no matter what their heritage, abilities, sexuality, class, or gender. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you, Mish. Hello, everyone. The title of the Casson Memorial Lecture is No Barriers to Brilliance, Social and Creative Courage to Innovate and Disrupt Occupational Therapy Practice. It's a privilege to be a Cassonite and an occupational therapist. And I'm going to say it again. It's a privilege to be an occupational therapist and a Cassonite. Privilege comes from the Latin privilegium, meaning a law for just one person. A benefit enjoyed by an individual or group beyond what is available to others. For me, today, this sums up privilege. It was a tweet from Duncan Brew, a trauma surgeon. Overseas trained doctor at their first trauma call in the NHS, to me as team leader, and asked, what will be my privilege in the care of the patient? Some things are found, not lost in translation. Every role we play in the care of others is a privilege. And that's important. Every role we play in the care of others is a privilege. I currently have a privilege because I made it into this mind-blowing, exciting profession. A mixed heritage background, a daughter of immigrants who could hardly speak English when they arrived in the UK. To openly acknowledge now that we have privileges is the first step in recognising that we need to overcome systematic inequalities for everyone. We are charged with embedding other therapists, students, and service users to overcome inequality issues to allow success for all. And this is what I'm trying to do. But the statistics are backed against BAME occupational therapists. Just 9% of the workforce are from a minority background. And that's a minute number of occupational therapists. If we think of the BAME background in the NHS, it's almost 20%. Equality has always been part of my upbringing, of a Germanic Sikh household, and boy, did the fireworks fly in our household. Sikhism promotes equality, namely all individuals, regardless of their gender, race, disability, class or wealth, are treated with respect and dignity. Sikhs believe in the oneness of humanity and highlighted through their actions in the community. And it's this idea of actions in the community that we will return to as we progress through the lecture. Slide, please. We've all heard about Elizabeth Yates, and this is how she ended her 1994 Casson Memorial Lecture. She stated, "I look forward to attending the conference in future years to listen to the therapists chosen to give the Casson Memorial Lecture, highlighting what's been achieved, the progress made by the profession to equalise opportunities, and then the profession can truly say it practices equal opportunities." Slide, please. 12 years later, Pollard in 2006 wrote a thoughtful account about diversity in the profession, claiming that it could never be because we didn't have a critical mass of diverse occupational therapists, dominated by the white female middle class. I totally disagree with this statement 15 years later. I believe there is enough people here today in the profession who want change. We will no longer put up with, "I tried, I can't do it, it's not possible." Our Casson is an open response to Elizabeth Yates. It's a lecture that belongs to each and every one of you. I want you to go away with questions, solutions, and desire to do things differently. It's going to require social and creative courage to remove barriers to success for equity for all occupational therapists and populations. I hope it will inspire you to reflect on your own practice and how we meet the current and future needs of global populations. Indeed, some of you may hear today, may make you feel uncomfortable. It might make you shy away. I am not here to do this, but I want you to go away and listen. Indeed, courage is the central point of this lecture. Indeed, Wendy Bryant, in her critique of her own Casson Memorial Lecture, focused around occupational therapy alienation. She stated, "I am now imagining future Casson lectures will take us forward to new understandings for occupational therapy. I hope to do this." We also need to use the late, great Professor Rosemary Barnett as an inspiration from her own Casson Memorial Lecture in 1991, Through a Glass Darkly. She stated she made a point to teach students how to protest in response to her requests about the lack of debate and political ideas within the profession. She asked then the very relevant question, why weren't we fighting systems which led to inequality for students, patients, and social services and the NHS staff? Why is it then in 2021 that equity suddenly became the subject of OT Week, only 30 years later? Do we hide under terms such as occupational justice that makes us feel good, but are not actually part of our everyday practice? Perhaps we perceive it out of our control. Perhaps we don't really care. But we do need to be wary of people who practice something called optical allyship, These persons speak out in support of racial equality, but whose systems and processes or actions do not involve equality to BAME persons. During the lecture, we're going to draw on data from some workshops with BAME occupational therapists and managers. But what is completely missing in the occupational literature is the voice of the service user from BAME communities, the invisibility of the BAME voice from the consumer perspective. The exception is a study by Kirsch et al. 2006, and we will frame some of the lecture around some of the themes that was identified from the paper. Slide, please. How are we going to keep the profession moving to prevent it from deconditioning? How can we keep it fresh, relevant, fluid, innovative, creative, and relevant? What should occupational therapy look like, sound like in 2021 and beyond? One thing is for sure, it's going to require all of us to have social and creative courage. In my mind, there is no doubt that Elizabeth Casson was an activist who would have been aware of social issues related to race and gender. In 1918, the Representation of the People's Act was passed, which allowed women over the age of 30 to vote who met a property qualification. I think it's really interesting to note that men were only allowed in Dorset School of Occupational Therapy in 1976. And what we're told, it was only 3 men. And it'd be lovely to know who these 3 men actually were. In 1919, as already stated, Dr. Casson graduated from the University of Bristol. It was a time, however, when Liverpool and other cities had major race riots, specifically aimed at non-white people who were thought to be stealing jobs. And haven't we heard that one before? What we don't know is Dr. Casson's perceptions about race, but we are aware that she understood the importance of housing and the protection of green spaces for health and well-being. Dr. Casson was not only a social reformer, but she added creativity and fairness to the homes that she rented. Dr. Casson highlights the need for occupational therapists to be activists and relevant in relation to patients' recovery, highlighting the need to recognise and value occupation to promote recovery. In fact, she knew and understood the importance of occupation within daily routines and the negative side effects of inactivity. This is now referred to as deconditioning. Slide, please. Arthur J. Brock in the British Medical Journal in 1934 quoted Dr. Casson. And what's amazing about this is the fact that they understood and valued the need for purposeful and meaningful occupation. Nothing was worse for patients than to drift about aimlessly. Next slide, please. But I want to draw you to the work of Sidney Licht, 1950, who discusses the need for tonic occupational therapy. And what a lovely word tonic occupational therapy is. Tonic occupational therapy aims to prevent deconditioning. It works on healthy muscles. Words used to describe the meaning of tonic are invigorating, refreshing, rejuvenating, restorative, reviving, stimulating. It's time, please, for that tonic. I would suggest that occupational therapy roots are firmly embedded not only within public health and social prescribing, but also in the community. I am certain that Dr. Casson would be disappointed to find out that a survey found that 44% of white people spent time in the countryside and just 26% of BAME people. 40% of BAME people live in areas of deprived green spaces compared with 14% of white people. In the UK, housing remains a political and societal issue. Despite our obvious roots and skill set, we often underplay our role and must continue with Dr. Casson's work. Housing overcrowding affects 30% of Bangladeshi households, 16% of Black African, and 7% of Black Caribbean, compared with just 2% of white households in the UK. Compared with all the regions, London in particular, where Dr. Casson worked, the highest rates of overcrowding are in 13% of minority households, compared with just 3% of white British households. We need to understand the concept of corrosive disadvantage. It's a term that is used to suggest that one disadvantage is likely to lead to a further disadvantage. For example, if a person is unable to access a green space, this in itself may not be a disadvantage itself, but it becomes a double disadvantage if you can't exercise, which can lead to health and well-being issues. This has to be part of an occupational therapist toolkit. The index of multiple deprivation refers to 7 dimensions: income, employment, health, education, barriers to housing and service, crime and living environments. As occupational therapists, do we really consider all these factors within our practice? If not, why not? And how does our practice need to change? Slide, please. I think it's really important that within the regions where we live, we recognise and value our local Black civil rights leaders. And today, I'm going to introduce you to Olive Morris. And the reason why is because Olive Morris lived and worked in Brixton, just down the road from Elizabeth Casson. But she's slightly different from Elizabeth Casson because she was a squatter. And Olive Morris is a global legend within Brixton. This is a mural to her because she was so good at breaking in people's houses, because it was a direct response to empty house syndrome in the 80s. Now, Olive Morris unfortunately died in her 20s, but I am positive she would have been friends with Elizabeth Casson, because there are different types of disruptors, and we will come to the different types of disruptors. What is evident is that the profession does not reflect local communities we are here to serve. Already in 1996, a survey found that 59% of occupational therapists agreed that where they worked, the workforce did not reflect their local communities it served. Managers who attended our workshop were also aware of this. But one Black female therapist who worked in a prison mentioned the fact that she was frequently stopped by prison officers to ask who she was actually visiting in the prison. We have a high amount of vacancies in areas with high minority groups, and I wonder why that actually is. I would also suggest that the continued focus on self-promotion is our biggest threat to the profession, and by not tackling and solving workforce issues, we are in danger of losing posts and credibility. Indeed, we have not heeded Gail Mountain's warning in her 2005 Casson Memorial Lecture, intriguingly entitled "To Confront, Defy, Face Up to Difficulty that Stimulates Interest or Effort." In the lecture, she suggested that a strategy that is focused on self-promotion could be detrimental, as it is not focusing on the needs of service users. It's time to stop that. We are here, as I said right at the beginning, to care for patients. And it's a privilege to do the job as an occupational therapist. There has been some interest within the profession to drive diversity, normally under the umbrella of the recruitment crisis in occupational therapy. But nowhere do we see a sense of value that BAME people bring to communities or the profession. Interesting, it's hard to find data on this, but one thing is for sure, it's hard for everyone, white or black, actually to enter the profession in the first place. We don't have a shortage of applicants, but it appears we may have a shortage of places. On one university website, it proudly says that 1 in 3 get an offer from that university. I think it's astounding that we don't actually know what happens to the people who don't get into occupational therapy. Whilst the international recruitment flag is currently being flied by Health Education England and received a very positive response from the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, we need to think carefully how an international workforce fits into the culture and the profession. Is it right to take occupational therapists from other cultures who may have a workforce shortage themselves and not pay compensation for that? Indeed, the routine practice of international recruitment appears never to have been questioned. It's viewed as normal practice because we need to look after the citizens of the NHS. Perhaps we need to think about this differently and think about workforce issues very differently too. In a rare study that compared school leavers with their white counterparts, it found that BAME school leavers wanted to work within a profession with prestige that involved a science. The survey found that BAME young people associated occupational therapy with nursing and that perception of the OT salary was low. Possibly the term allied reinforced the image of occupational therapy being inferior to medicine. However, we need to remember that 18-year-olds from advantaged backgrounds are about 2.5 times more likely to enter higher education than those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. Indeed, 6 times more likely to go to the most selective institutions. The current government strategy is now focusing on disadvantaged students, aiming to be admitted to the highest quality institutions. So what does this mean for occupational therapy courses that are set up in institutions that are not deemed to be a high-ranking university in league tables? Does it matter? I am concerned about discrepancies between entry requirements and performance. No research has been performed to look at performance of students from different institutions. But what is clear to me, we need a better system of working together across universities. But not all young people from BAME backgrounds are equally disadvantaged. Strand analysis found that the 2 lowest achieving groups were Black Caribbean and white British boys, followed by girls of lower socioeconomic status. Perhaps this is our starting point. It is a competitive world and needs a whole new strategy, taking into account parental aspirations, community perceptions of career choices, and needs of community populations. So let's go back to that word disruption. Disruption in relation to change and action. We need to be mindful that positive disruptive behaviours can raise attention and raise awareness and influence decision makers. However, disruptive behaviours alone do not work as a standalone strategy, as evident by some of the frustrations expressed by disruptors on social media. In fact, the best way to achieve change is to disrupt and then build a case driven by evidence-based data. Allyship was branded at the Royal College of Occupational Therapists Conference as one mechanism to address equality and diversity issues within the profession. The 7 A's of allyship, focusing on authenticity of relationships. Slide, please. But I want us to think very differently about allyship. I want us to think about this definition. The important words within this definition are co-conspirators, sponsorship, and personal relationships. But it's that word co-conspirator that I'm interested in. Co-conspirators plot the future of the profession together. A co-conspirator is an advance on the model of allyship. If you accept the invitation, it asks that you are not just believing in equity, you want to take action. It also means that persons with privileges are willing to collaborate. As a profession, we appear to be quite cautious about rocking the status quo. Indeed, the preferred box of our COVID equality status survey in relation to equity issues was neither disagree or agree. Interesting, the Germans have formulated a new verb based on their soon-to-be ex-Chancellor Angela Merkel. The verb Merkel is used to mean to be unable to make decisions or give your own opinions, and can be used to describe someone who just stays there without doing anything. Does it sound familiar? I hope not. If you choose to be a co-conspirator, it does mean there may be consequences for taking action. Courageous individuals are prepared to face tough decisions and confront the uncertainties associated with their resolve to do the right thing. They are often not popular. Take, for example, Martin Luther King. He was one of the most hated persons in the US. To do this, however, we need to reflect on our profession. A careful examination, both inside us as occupational therapists and outside to the profession, citizens and consumers. In other words, a whole systems approach. The focus today is on dominant groups and dominant healthcare cultures changing and adapting, not BAME persons. This is not the case in professional practice. I would suggest that the bias towards white women in the profession therefore affects and mirrors the provision of occupational therapy services by providers. What is of interest in the US is that the early civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, established their own community hospitals to enable greater local control of the health of the community. There is currently an emerging trend by BAME persons to have services specifically provided by BAME persons. In Brixton, we have Black Thrive and Black Mind. Services set up where you can actually find a Black therapist. My worst fear is that this will occur in occupational therapy. My greatest fear is that it will reflect Stokely Carmichael's version, a civil rights leader who believed to achieve equality during the civil rights process in the US, persons of colour had to achieve unity and a power base independent of white structures. If this was not the case, the whites and persons of colour could not collaborate due to different power structures. And we need to think about this really carefully. Slide, please. Let's start with what BAME persons actually think about occupational therapists. So they emphasise the importance of social locations. In other words, therapists sharing something about themselves and their own culture. A sense of safety and comfort in the relationship, regardless of whether the therapist shares the same group membership. In reverse, for us as occupational therapists, this means critically reflecting on whether cultural safety is in existence for BAME occupational therapists. The dominant group is still the white female therapist, and evidence from our workshops suggests that BAME occupational therapists need to fit into already pre-existing structures, with little of them changing or no intention of them actually changing or adapting. Slide, please. There is a sense that BAME occupational therapists perceived they could not be their authentic self. This means having to fit into a team and or dampen down their lovely, bubbly personalities. Other BAME occupational therapists refer to how vigilant they were at all times and being guarded. They describe their experiences as don't belong or face don't fit. Indeed, a small qualitative study from Ireland found similar themes. But what was really interesting from this study is that minority occupational therapists reported that some colleagues perceived that colleagues were intolerant of the need for cultural learning. The lack of visibility of BAME occupational therapists is evident everywhere. Why then are some therapists questioned as to why they had not chosen nursing as a profession? How did someone like you get into the profession? What's someone like me? Such views and lack of visibility are having a real world impact on global populations, the populations we are asked to serve. Or the sense perhaps we can say, by not being seen, they are not being valued. Persons from BAME communities, slide please, wanted to share all of themselves. But do therapists truly want to be person-centered? And I saw this tweet from Samantha White, who tweeted towards the end of Equity Week. She said, I thought I would share this with you. I was in supervision with an OT. She told me she'd asked the client to tell her his story. He replied he had never been asked this before. Discussions around identity are frequent within the occupational therapy literature. But here is my frustration. When do we see occupational therapists finding time to implement these principles of actually understanding the person, not just knowing them? And here is a lovely quote from Claire Spatman. Slide, please. In 1939, she wrote this already about the value of valuing consumers, of valuing patients. And it's from a paper that was delivered in 1936. And I love this quote. She says, it requires the ability to put aside all personal prejudices and feelings, to give oneself in the same degree to the cross, cantankerous, dirty, ignorant, and perhaps uninteresting charity patient, to the lovely, charming, cultivated, and interesting private patient. So I'm going to say it again. We have a duty as occupational therapists to serve the global population. But what about occupation? What do we actually mean about this? BAME consumers spoke of the need for therapists to understand how diversity intersects with occupation, to shape people's ways of doing, and to attend to how culture influences identity, the emotional investment in what they do. In fairness to the profession, there has been some noise about the need for cultural diversity, for culturally relevant practice, but this is not always implemented into professional practice, and this is one of your challenges today. What's really important, I think, is to think about Britain and its history, its colonialism, its takeover of other territories. Britain has had many territories abroad, and I believe has impacted on occupational therapists' reluctance to think about equality. A key feature of colonisation was social stratification. Slide, please. In which persons or groups are ranked. Persons can be categorised by income, gender, social status, or social and political persons. The antidote to colonisation is decolonisation, but this is not new. So let's start with the term occupation as the concept of occupational therapy. Slide, please. It's important to note that in many countries in Europe use the word ergotherapy and not occupational therapy. Ergo comes from the Greek word ergon and means to conquer, compose, to produce. Ergotherapy means to compose and apply a method for improving the health of the patient. A notable exception is those countries who were colonised by the British. They use the term occupational therapy. Indeed, a fascinating article in Occupational Therapy in 1972 suggested that the UK should stop using the word occupational therapy and replace it with ergotherapy. Although it is interesting that the World Federation of Occupational Therapy uses the term occupational therapy, despite claiming to be the voice of global occupational therapists. For the sake of argument, slide please, we will look at two definitions of occupation that you will know well. One from the Royal College of Occupational Therapists and one from the World Health Organization. But I want you to focus on the one by Doris Pierce and how she defines occupation. Occupation is defined as culturally and personally meaningful activities in which humans engage that can be named in the lexicon of our culture. How niche is that? And why aren't we using that definition of culture? And why aren't we expanding it already into our existing definitions of occupation? Even now, we are none the wiser to culturally meaning occupations to all citizens. We don't know the preferred occupations, for example, of the Trinidadian populations, other than verbal accounts from therapists. Indeed, our own research that's currently taking place in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago has already identified that certain activities, such as cards, are associated with gambling. But what has really struck me about Trinidad and Tobago is that they too are wrestling with similar social issues, such as hostility against migrants from Venezuela. Elizabeth Yates, in her Casson Lecture, had already expressed concern that persons from minority groups and with low incomes are subjected to marginalisation or harassment by their clinical supervisors. I find that quite shocking. In the UK study, in Kirsch's study, she was quick to point out in her study that consumers, vain consumers of occupational therapists, wanted to point out that they themselves perceived they had not experienced discrimination, but were often left wondering over subtle negative experiences which could be related to their minority status. And I think it's important that we think about uncivil behaviour and its relationship to racism. Likewise, Johnson et al. Performed an audit of occupational therapy. They said they found no systematic bias, except that Asian clients were more likely to be referred by certain channels to require major work and had to wait longer for action. I personally would be quite concerned about the findings from that study. Data from the Black Voices report has already emphasised the absence of BAME presence across boardrooms. Interesting, 62% of charity boards are composed of all white members. It is pleasing to see that this has been addressed by the Elizabeth Casson Trust, but my plea is to be bolder and courageous. Interestingly, I recently met a community leader who asked me how he could learn to navigate white spaces in boardrooms. A lot to reflect on, and I'm sure we could learn from his experiences. I think for far too long, occupational therapists have used their social positions to promote their own networks and friends. Are you in the inner circle or the outer circle? Do occupational therapists exhibit the same bias as the wider populations? Evidence from a systematic review found that healthcare professionals exhibit the same levels of implicit bias as the wider population and impact on clinician-patient interaction. The much anticipated and controversial race report from the Commission of Race and Ethnic Disparities was published in 2021, but there was no official response from the profession. Indeed, the British Medical Association response to this stated it did not go far enough, and really what was actually needed was acceptance that structural racism exists, explicit determination to tackle structural racism, and cultural transformation across all levels of the healthcare sector. What I liked about the response was the clear outcomes associated with effect and impact, as well as a clear mandate for action. But I think it's a survey by Bog in 2006 that sets the tone for inaction and inactivity around BAME career progression and where we are. Just over 50% of people who replied to the survey perceived that minority groups experience barriers to career progression. In contrast, no white occupational therapists perceived their ethnicity as a barrier to future career progression. What is evident from the Black Voices survey is that 33% of Black employees perceive that their own ethnicity would be a barrier to career progression, compared to only 1% of white persons. Data from a co-conspirator, and we will publish the data for occupational therapists as soon as we get it under the Freedom of Information Act, is a lady called Sheila Cunliffe. She has recently published the data under the Freedom of Information Act in 2021, in fact, a few weeks ago, that found that doctors applying for medical posts in London are 6 times more likely to be offered a job than Black applicants. And I think if she puts the data for nursing, it's also very high as well. I can share with you from the one trust that we have had back, it's 3 times more likely if you're a BAME occupational therapist not to get an 8A job and beyond than if you're a white therapist. But it should come to no surprise to us, because the McGregor-Smith review in 2017 highlighted this in a report called Race in the Workplace. But again, we did a Merkel as a profession, no response, no action. The report found that BAME persons are much more likely to be overqualified for the jobs that they go for, but less likely to be promoted. One of the key issues that has come across from our workshop was BAME occupational therapists' perceptions of the management of racist incidents, both on placement and in the workforce. Indeed, managers were aware of failings in this system, slide please, but wanted support as best how to approach this, and perhaps thinking about how they'd make themselves unpopular by tackling issues in practice. BAME occupational therapists perceived there was a lack of policy, procedure, and commitment to manage these issues. Increasingly, we are aware of users being aggressive to staff under the umbrella of being frustrated with long waiting lists. But racism, I think this is the most amazing statistic and the saddest statistic from today. 1 in 4 persons in the UK admit to being racist. That's 1 in 4 persons that you may meet within professional practice as a BAME or white occupational therapist, with more than 1/3 of persons who voted Leave, Brexit, sharing this characteristic. And the question that I actually think perhaps needs to be asked, and students, please chat your response to this, is should we be telling students from day one that the NHS is racist, or the people who come into the NHS are racist? Plant and Divine differentiate between groups of allies, internal and external allies. Internal allies are people who are internally motivated to respond without prejudice and do so out of their own personal values and convictions. Externally motivated allies are concerned with avoiding others' perceptions that are discriminatory or racist. So which one do you want to be, the internal or the external ally? Reporting incidents, completing datexes does not resolve the issue. Supportive and inclusive environments will not change anything. It's about changing the approach and the structures. Racism is not acceptable, and or just moving the racist patient from a BAME occupational therapist to a white occupational therapist. It's not just the conversations and the words that matter. We need support from you, but we need to take a firmer stance with a clear mandate from the professional leaders. There is experimental data that skin colour is important in decision-making. And Sheila quotes some lovely, rich, qualitative data from doctors, but I think it's very relevant to occupational therapists. So, one consultant wrote, even though he is Black, they all love him, and they don't see him as different from us. At a consultant interview, a panel member asked him, do you know this is the white area? This is 2021. I can hear you all saying, not me, I wouldn't do anything like that. Of course not. One study found clear racial bias in shooting decisions against BAME persons when they were present in perceived threatening neighbourhoods and perceived threatening clothing. It was reduced when BAME persons were in safe neighbourhoods and wearing perceived safe clothing. And again, on Twitter, we have a quote from a nurse. Somebody actually tweeted by accident about her application, saying, which simply said, another one, but again, Nigerian. This happens in professional practice. Next slide, please. Winston Churchill said, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. So thank you for that. Creative courage is the discovery of the new forms, new symbols, new patterns on which a new society can be built. To do this, we desperately need data in all areas. We need large-scale studies on which we can perceive what minorities perceive about occupational therapy and the effectiveness of interventions we provide. The Royal College of Occupational Therapists research priorities also need to reflect this. And most importantly, create research with and not on behalf of service users, understanding co-production and not consultation. We need to make better use of sponsorship. This is a strong theme that emerged not only from our own workshops, but also from the Black Voice Report 2020. I am going to suggest that Dr. Casson succeeded in becoming a female doctor, not only because of her brilliance, but because of sponsorship. Her uncle was a vice chancellor of the University of Bristol and promised her a place if she passed the entrance exams. So Elizabeth had some extra help to help her achieve her goals. Let's think about this in relation to equality. What can we do as a profession to give someone the extra hand to enable career success for all? In my view, social connectivity appears to be key within career development and to create opportunities for colleagues. Leaders need to show courage by stepping back and letting others lead. One US study found that persons in leadership who identified as BAME had a greater commitment to diversity issues, although white women, when they were in a leadership role, they were less committed to diversity. Followership is important, as it is leading by example. It gives others permission to do so. In other words, courage is transmittable to others in a very positive way. We need to recruit from local communities who know and are committed to serving local communities, a sense of belonging. We need occupational therapists to belong to communities they are privileged to be part of. This is going to mean we reach all communities, not the chosen few. Never accept the reason given by some managers or policymakers that it is impossible to make services equitable. Become part of the community and think about doing things differently. Think outside of what has always been done before. Social courage is viewed as the most important dimension of courage in the workplace and refers as the ability to engage in meaningful relationships with others and involves the willingness to risk oneself for the good of others. The risks involved could damage your relationships and your social image. Key characteristics associated with social courage include grit and a proactive personality. Grit is associated with a predisposition towards perseverance and a passion for long-term goals. Proactive individuals are similarly known to persist through difficulties. It is clear that the profession is deconditioned and needs tonic occupational therapy to make it future-proof to ensure its sustainability. The word movement is currently advocated in the Royal College of Occupational Therapy Strategic Aims, social movement. I would like us to think about the term movement differently from how it is defined in the strategic end. It is defined as build a social movement, a proud and confident occupational therapist that show the world the power of what we do. So social movements are groups of persons that involve an organised effort to achieve a particular goal that can either be social or political. Social movements should be looking for change in ethical values, which oppresses certain communities. So in my mind, we need to do this first. Our primary concern is show the world what we do, but demonstrating on impact. Then the world will notice what we actually do. We need to have a much better understanding of community grassroots organisations, such as Black Thrive or One Mind, set up for mental health for travellers. So the past Casson lectures are truly wonderful. But what has struck me is that their actions have disappeared into history. This Casson will not be put in the back of our minds and forgotten about. We will need to ensure that a summary of progress is made prior to each Casson lecture. So next slide, please. So let's go back to Yeats's conclusion. It is clear, next slide please, we have let her down. Are we going to have the courage to make a difference? Perhaps the launch of the Fairness Observatory by the Elizabeth Casson Trust is a positive step. But the word fair is going to need some unpacking, which I really look forward to being part of. Fairness means treating people according to their needs, which in turn does not mean it will actually be fair. How far or how are you going to use your social and creative courage? Dr. Elizabeth Casson is a modern day icon, occupational therapist, doctor, leader, innovator, reformer, public health advocate, entrepreneur, disruptor, academic, patron, and pioneer. She did not lack professional confidence or courage. We need to be aware of and resolve the profession's disconnectedness to the community and to each other. We need unity and strength to pull together. All of this cannot be done or achieved in isolation, but requires a whole systems approach. Do you have the social and creative courage to become a co-conspirator? What changes can we make together as a profession? Thank you.
Sorry, I was so excited and I forgot to unmute myself. It's kind of the kind of situation we're currently in, isn't it? And what you missed me saying was, wow. Anita, thank you. That was an absolutely brilliant lecture. There have been lots of questions coming through for you. So without further ado, can I ask you back onto the platform? And I will start off with asking you some questions from this evening. Okay, one of the first questions that came through, Anita, was how are we going to inspire people for this authentic allyship?
I have, as you can probably see, an issue with authentic allyship because I actually believe it's a discovery phase. I believe we're done with it now. So having conversations and having talks is great. We've been seen to be having talks and conversations for a long time now, but no action. I think the only way we're going to move forward is by strategic change, and that means changing processes and practices. So it's actually looking very clearly at what our admission criteria are into universities, how we recruit, how we interview. But I feel we need an agreement across all universities, across practice. We need some best practice guidelines. And yes, being authentic, listening to each other, being kind to each other is what we do. We should all be good allies for each other. But I think it's time now to stop talking and collect the data and move forward.
I think that was very clear in the lecture, Anita, and I'll try and sum some of that up at the end. But you've actually just primed the next question really nicely, and that was, and you may or may not have a view on this. Do you feel the withdrawal of the NHS funding for university training has had a disproportionate impact on the BAME community?
Absolutely, and I think it's continued to having one during COVID, and I think it's something that I was going to address actually with the Royal College, because I know at London South Bank we have lots of students that are currently struggling that can't get extra funding because they've been directly impacted upon by COVID. I think it's a complicated scenario when universities agreed to remove the bursary, and I don't think universities and Arcot shouted loud enough to stop it being removed. And I think it's something we have to consider about whether or not we can put up scholarships. What can we do to enable people from socially deprived backgrounds, socio-economic backgrounds to come into the profession? Can we do something more? And I believe we can. I really, really believe we can. We've seen Oxford and Cambridge do it. We've seen other really prestigious institutions do it. Why can't we do it? And I think it's a conversation with NHS England and Health Education England as well. We're all in this together. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to offer funding, and I'm passionate that that is the way forward. We can offer scholarships. Why can't we do that?
Great answer, Anita, thank you. Just maybe a slightly, well, back into the lecture, but as a more generic question, I suppose, but it's actually come through in a number of different ways. And I suppose to summarise it, is what are your thoughts on the term BAME and its use as a collective noun?
I deliberately didn't go there, and I'll tell you why. I am not one of these people that argue over terms. It's a bit like occupational therapy. You know, all these terms and what is it and what model do you use? I don't give a damn, to be quite honest. And I know it's individualised. We should always ask somebody. That's absolutely what we do as occupational therapists, a person-centred approach. But to be honest, it's a distraction from the real problem, which is what we're going to do as a profession. It's a distraction. We don't want distractions anymore.
Yeah.
I think
Great
we need
answer.
to move forward.
I've got a lovely question here from a first-year student of occupational therapy. She'd previously spent 15 years working with people with complex needs, with social, emotional and mental health issues, particularly within children. And she's very interested in not only BAME culturally, but all culture, including BAME. It's been mentioned during the lecture that there is a lack of research in particular areas where occupational therapists may be able to move into. Do you have any suggestions for specific areas that need to be researched or have not been researched before?
It's everything. It's such a lovely way to think about occupational therapy, and I'm really proud that you're thinking about research. I think we need to start auditing, we need to start benchmarking, we need to collect the data, because we know nothing at the moment. But I think the biggest thing we need to do as a start, which has to be our research priority, is to find out what BAME consumers think about occupational therapy. What do we need to do differently, if anything? And I'm thinking about long COVID services at the moment, because we know the BAME community are not accessing long COVID clinics. Why aren't they? What's going on? And we know the BAME community have been disproportionately impacted on by COVID. So what is going on? And why aren't we bothered as occupational therapists? Why aren't we asking these questions? You know, we need to bring equality and diversity issues at every meeting that we go to.
Thank you, Liz. Your passion is just palpable. I think what I should say with all of these questions is everybody is starting them off with saying thank you. And, you know, the one I'm going to share with you now is it starts off with thank you for a stimulating and challenging talk. But goes on to say, what do you think are the key elements of and the steps towards decolonizing the occupational therapy curriculum and then developing ourselves?
I think personally we're looking at decolonisation in the wrong way, because we're seeing it from a perhaps old-fashioned historical perspective, but we're not actually involving service users within it. So I think we need to understand the needs of service users, and then we can start to decolonise as well, think about all those practices, etc. But the simple things to do obviously are around culture, washing and dressing, how to put on a turban, how to start your beard, how to deal with black hair. If you're not getting it as students, ask for it, demand it, require it. It's invincible. How to put on a sari. You need to be able to do this. So that's part of the decolonisation of the curriculum, is actually making it relevant to all populations. So I'm quite sceptical of decolonisation as the answer, but I think we need to take a step back, as always, and take it to the consumers of occupational therapy. And that's why I'm saying start with what the BAME populations want from occupational therapists, because we don't know.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I think probably looking at the time, our final question, and I suppose it's more of a statement, but there is a question. I feel that much of what you have said also applies to the disabled community and other protected characteristics. I just wonder, what are your thoughts on feeling that disability has fallen off the EDI agenda?
That is so correct. And I remember when I did my master's of writing an essay, double disability, being Black and disabled. So you're absolutely correct. And disability has gone off the agenda too. And I think we perhaps, I'm putting words into Arcott's mouth and Diane's mouth at the moment, we can have a separate discussion around disability, particularly in relation to long COVID, and particularly to long-term conditions and life-limiting change conditions. So I think it's such a valid point as well, such a valid point. So thank you for that.
Well, Anita, just thank you so much. I think we'll have to wrap up the Q&A at this point. There are so many more questions, but also what we aim to do, colleagues, is actually send Anita the questions, and she's going to aim to respond to some of those questions. And when this stream goes up on the website, we will put a collection of those Q&As, frequently asked questions type of thing, with Anita's responses up there, but I haven't done them justice, Anita. That you'll see when you get the questions through. There's been some, you've really provoked thought, so thank you very much for that. And it now just gives me chance to reflect on that lecture. And there was so much in Anita's lecture that it's certainly going to take me a considerable amount of time to reflect on the lecture. And as you know, Casson lectures are in time published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, so please do look out for that as well. Plus, this lecture will be available to listen to again on the website. But my thoughts, I'm sitting here as one of those past Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturers, and it's always inspiring, always thought-provoking. But I think what you've done tonight, Anita, is call us to action. We've had to rethink our terms and terminologies. You've really focused us in on what the consumer perspective is, and that we're missing that in our data. And in fact, we're missing data full stop. And that we all as occupational therapists have a role in that social and creative courage to act as your co-conspirators. And I loved that phrase that you brought out from allyship, that it's about us being an active co-conspirator. By also that sponsorship and sponsoring others. I think one of the joys we have as occupational therapists is we are working with a diverse group of people, but we're also supporting and mentoring other occupational therapists. So I think for me, there's a sponsorship role there that we perhaps haven't had so overtly in the future. I loved your phrase around the disruption. It's all well and good disrupting, but you've then got to take that a stage further and build a case based on evidence-based data, and absolutely wholeheartedly support that. I think you repeated on a number of times that we have to think about the global populations and the populations in which we serve, and actually, are we truly being authentic to the whole of those populations? And no longer can we get away with the phrase, I tried, I can't do it, it's not possible. And I think you really made us sit back and reflect. One of the things that I came out with, and I'm sitting here thinking of my fellow educators at this point, is you've given a great debate for all occupational therapists to now take forward, and that is the NHS and racism. And I think I'd love to see that being debated in all programmes and really getting a sense of what our thoughts are there, not shying away from the difficult subjects that we are going to be challenged with. At this point, I think I'm going to stop on my reflections because I've written pages and pages and I cannot reflect on all of it without actually repeating your lecture, Anita, which isn't really the point. I just want to say thank you. Thank you on behalf of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists with the Elizabeth Casson Trust. And we will be sending you, Anita, a special token to acknowledge you joining the esteemed group of Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lectures. So unfortunately, colleagues, it is now time for us to say thank you for those joining us and goodbye to all of our audience, of which there are over 600 watching tonight. And I know a considerable higher number had registered and therefore will be watching the stream at a later time. I hope you've enjoyed our broadcast of the 2021 Casson Lecture. The 2022 Casson Lecture will take place in April next year. If you remember, colleagues, we're slightly out of sync because of COVID. So we've had 3 Casson Lectures in quite quick succession, which is absolutely delightful. But do keep an eye out for further information on the date of the 2022 Casson Lecture in April. And thank you and good night.